Well, it's lovely to be here with you. Thank you for your invitation. And I was saying to Mark earlier, I feel rather at home here. I came from a Scottish summer, and the weather here is about the same, especially the cold days. And I was sitting watching rugby on Saturday evening with Simon Manchester, watching Australia get thrashed by New Zealand. And that really made me feel at home too, because most of the rugby I watch, my team is getting thrashed by everybody. So I feel very at home already. But anyway, it's nice to be with you. I've been looking these last few days with the ministers in the Ministry Training and Development Conference. We've been looking at the letter of Romans, and not Romans 16. We never got that far, but it is a chapter, isn't it, that's often just skipped over. It usually comes under the title of, various greetings or something like that, and we hardly notice it. But in fact, when you understand that the whole of the letter to the Romans is a letter all about the kind of real gospel partnership that is going to be needed if the gospel does go out to the whole world, as Paul is determined that it will do, then in fact it's a very important chapter. Real gospel mission needs real gospel people. And this list is probably the longest or the fullest in the New Testament. And if we look at it, we're not going to look at it in detail at all tonight, but just in the passing, it's of great interest, I think, to see some of the variety of roles that are played. I suspect that few of these were what we would call today full-time workers, but all of them are clearly people, aren't they, who are focused very much on gospel work and on each playing a part. And it's full of men and women working together. In fact, first of all, we have Phoebe, who's mentioned, somebody who used her wealth for the gospel. Whether she's an official deacon or not, whatever that means, who knows? But she certainly served, and Paul says she was a patron of many. In other words, she financially supported many, including the apostle himself. It's easy to skip over that, but how many great gospel movements would never have got off the ground if there weren't people who opened their purse strings for the gospel? Think of the Countess of Huntingdon and how she bankrolled so much of the ministry of the likes of Wesley and Whitfield and so on. One of the phrases that I've always remembered of Dick Lucas, and there are quite a few of them, but I don't know if any of you, none of the younger ones here, will have ever met or heard Dick Lucas. You may have heard of him on tapes, but I remember once when I was working with him in London, we were going off somewhere, and I was asking him about the early days at St. Helens and how they got things started, and he said, well, the Lord was very kind in putting me smack in the middle of the city of London, where all the money in the world gets chased around. And he said, we had money men. And the ministry would never have got off the ground without that. And he said, yes, brother, I learned very early in my ministry that the widow's mite, though pleasing to God, will never run the church. And that's really rather true, isn't it? But Phoebe used her wealth for the Lord. Then, of course, we have Priscilla and Aquila, who used their wisdom as well as their wealth, their minds as well as their money for lots, including Paul. And notice also what he says, they risked their necks for him. Mark made some allusion to some of the things that we have gone through in our church and churches in Scotland in recent years. We've been ejected from our buildings, our properties, had legal things slapped upon us, had years of real battles and public opprobrium from all kinds of people. Let me tell you, in a situation like that, you value the loyalty of those who will risk their necks along with you very, very greatly indeed. I read these sort of things in the New Testament now with a great deal of understanding and appreciation that I never had before. But this chapter, I think, shows us a key mark of real gospel work, and that is that women are at work alongside men. Along with Phoebe, and Prisca and Junia, verse 6 told us about Mary, who, notice, worked hard for the church. There's Tryphema and Tryphosa. I've always thought they sounded rather a formidable pair of ladies, those two, but the beloved Persis. And all of these women are described as workers in the Lord. You notice that? All the women in Romans 16 are described as hard workers. I've often said if I want a job really well done in our church, I need to get a woman to do it. And if I can possibly get it, I would like a woman over the age of 70. because they came from an age where they understood duty and commitment, and if something was going to be done, they would do it until it was done. I don't find that too much in the under 40s, and certainly not in the under 20s. Hard workers. And Paul clearly cherishes all of these fellow workers. And notice also that he honors very specifically the particular feminine aspects of their work. So the mother of Rufus, who has also been a mother to me. Did you notice that? And no doubt to many others. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it, that there's no misogyny at all in Paul writing a chapter like this. Of course, he clearly differentiates between men and women, but he clearly greatly honors the ministry of women, just as he does the men's. And surely I think that indicates that a church of real gospel partnership will be marked by women hard at work for the Lord alongside men. I don't know enough about the situation here in Australia, but I can tell you that the main problem in the UK today is that it's often only the women who are at work in our churches. Often that is because they have been pushed into, or perhaps sometimes pushed themselves into work that men ought to be shouldering. But in many, many churches, the result is that men increasingly take a back seat and eventually disappear altogether. And that really leads to a disaster, because instead of gaining the gifts of women in the church, rather what's happening is we're losing both men and women. Because men fade away, either women have to take those roles or want those roles, but very often it's they have to because there are no men left to do them. And often that means that many uniquely feminine roles are being abandoned, or they're seen as demeaning, and they're being lost from our churches. So take mothering, as Paul speaks about there, that he values so highly in the mother of Rufus. And many women today, I find, would be very offended if you said that, well, you know, there's a great role for mothering in the church. When I was a young student, though, there were folk in the church that I went to who played exactly that role with me, who mothered me, just as Rufus's mother no doubt mothered Paul. It was a huge blessing. It was an enormously important thing in my Christian life and development. There were folks who would be like parents to us in the congregation, have us out for Sunday lunch, talk to us. I used to call it the ministry of the kitchen sink. I think it must have been before we had dishwashers, but we would be summoned by the lady of the house, one by one, the young male students, had to come and help with the dishes, whilst she would chat to us about the particular issue that she thought we needed to hear at the time. It might have been about, being a bit more tidy in terms of what we were wearing, or, well, I won't go into all the things because it's a bit embarrassing, but that was a very important ministry. In fact, I don't think I'd have been married today to the wife I'm married to if it wasn't for that particular mother, who one day in the kitchen sink took me aside, shut the door, gave me a sturdy nudge and said, "Get on with it." There's something particularly feminine about that kind of ministry that I greatly value. And it was very important. Now, I want that kind of thing for our younger students in our church today. I want that kind of mothering ministry. I think it's important. I want that kind of domestic and helpful training for young men that comes very often from a mother figure who's not your own mother, when you've left home and when you're perhaps a little bit more willing to listen. Some of our young men need to be told how they should be treating young women, and it's very often differently from the way that they are treating them. Some of our young women need to learn from some of the senior women about all kinds of things that only they can teach them. I think the whole scene in Timothy and Titus in particular, where these sorts of things are referred to, are talking about just exactly that natural kind of training and teaching that goes on in these sort of situations. You could call it mothering. And Paul values that. He doesn't demean it. He doesn't say that it's just an inferior thing. Not at all. You can't do it unless you're a mother. So So I think the biblical pattern in so many ways here, as of course elsewhere in the scripture, shows us a healthy way, not flattening out the differences between the sexes, but showing all together in a partnership that really is God-centered and oriented towards the service of the church and the growth and maturity of the church, not being me-centered and about fulfillment of my identity or my sense of that, whatever that might be. And I would just say that the more I've seen of life and ministry, I think the more that has just been borne out in my experience as a pastor, where you embrace the positive, God-given order of complementarity of the sexes. It leads to gospel partnership. It leads to a harmonious, healthy, fruitful serving alongside one another in the gospel that is fulfilling for all, but more importantly, furthers the gospel. Where, on the other hand, it's abandoned, what I've seen is disabling of the ministries of the church. And actually, in the end, bringing the exact opposite of what many who have argued vociferously for the egalitarian model of ministry are actually wanting to achieve. But in fact, the opposite is happening. Well, that's my perspective on things, and I'm sure some here might have different views. I'm not here tonight to kind of argue the theological positions and so on, but I do want to just give you some reflections from my own ministry experience in different contexts, things that I've observed myself about different aspects of women's ministry alongside men, and on the way just give some thoughts and some observations, perhaps one or two warnings worth noting. I'm very, very happy for you to push back and come back to me with questions, and I'll do my best to answer. But I want to talk about three areas, really. First of all, observations from a national church, that is the Church of Scotland, where I spent all my life until 2012, when our church had to part company with it. Then secondly, from my time as Director of Ministry at the Proclamation Trust in London, which was working with a large network of evangelical ministers and churches throughout the UK, mainly through England, but all the UK. I spent 5 years doing that in the 1999 to 2004. And then finally, just some reflections more briefly from my own experience as a senior pastor in our church, the Tron, for the last 11 years, which is a fairly sizable church in the city centre of Glasgow. And I want to just give you some observations and some of my thoughts, and you're welcome to ask me more. So first, some observations from my lifetime then in the Church of Scotland. Firstly, to talk in general about the impact of women's ordination in that denomination. The Church of Scotland today, the Church of Scotland is the national church in Scotland. It's like the Church of England in England, the only difference being that it's Presbyterian by government rather than Episcopal, but it's the national church, the established church in Scotland, the parish church. The Church of Scotland today has been notable for, certainly in the UK, taking something of a lead in the recognition of homosexual unions. The Scottish Parliament has now, along with the UK Parliament, legalised gay marriage. But some politicians, I think, in fact I know, were actually emboldened in pushing through that legislation because of the shifting ground within the Church of Scotland and the Church of Scotland's greater acceptance of these things. So I have it on pretty good authority that one of the things that emboldened our Scottish government to push ahead on this was the route that the Church of Scotland had previously taken. So there's an example of the church leading the world, and one of which I'm very ashamed. But the Church of Scotland also led the way on women's ordination in the UK in the 1960s. And of course these two things, I'm afraid, are clearly connected, because it is the same hermeneutic that gave us the one that has now given us the other. Many who were arguing for women's ordination at the time in the 60s totally denied that, would be absolutely horrified at where we are today. In fact, even a scholar like William Barclay, who is hardly really to be considered on the scale of evangelicalism, but I came across an article that he had written way back then, absolutely categorically against homosexual unions. But of course, I'm afraid that's where we've come. The seeds of gender confusion that were sown then have led ultimately to many today, like ourselves and others, being forced out of the church. So back in the 1960s, in 1966, our General Assembly voted to allow women's ordination as elders, and in 1968, just 2 years later, as ministers. And the first woman was ordained as a parish minister in 1969 in the Presbytery of Aberdeen. And it's perhaps not without note that exactly 40 years later, in 2009, it was the same Presbytery of Aberdeen that upheld the induction of the first minister in an openly gay union. There's some irony in that. By 2008, 18% of our parish ministers were women. By 2015, this year, it's just over 25%. There are about 1,000, bit over 1,000 parishes in the Church of Scotland today because of linkages and so on. There are about 200 vacancies. There are about 800, just over 800 parish ministers, and there are today 204 parish ministers who are women. There are about another 150 ordained ministers who are women who are in other positions like chaplaincies or various other things. But over a quarter of our parish ministers are women today. The peak of ordinations for women occurred in the 1990s, but since then the number of all ordinations has been decreasing, so it's been decreasing. But in the 1990s, it was vastly more men who were being ordained than women, but today it's about equal numbers. And in fact, in some of the training colleges in Glasgow, which is the biggest faculty, there are twice as many women training for parish ministry as men. The proportion of women to men in parish ministry in the Church of Scotland will go on increasing because 65% of parish ministers will be retired within 10 years. So the equalising is going to go through and will catch up. Only 10% of all ministers in the Church of Scotland are under the age of 45. So you don't need to know an awful lot about the theology of the denomination to know which way it's heading with that kind of aging profile in the clergy, but that's another whole talk altogether. The average woman parish minister in the Church of Scotland is in her mid-50s. About a little over half are married. The rest are single. Some are widowed or divorced. And I think now there are some with same-sex partners. Some are very liberal. Most, I think, are not very liberal, but they're just what we call Church of Scotland theology mostly just muddle in the middle. So kind of vague, really. And some would be evangelical. There have been evangelical women ordained from the earliest period of women's ordination in the Church of Scotland. It's worth noting that particularly in these earlier times, these women didn't argue on the grounds of egalitarianism. They argued on the grounds of exceptionalism. They agreed that the normal pattern would be male leadership, but that there were exceptions, especially if there were no men, so citing biblical characters like Deborah and so on. These were women who were genuinely concerned to take biblical teaching seriously. But in the end for them, I suppose the truth is that a sense of God's call became the overriding factor. So if God was calling you, then if you didn't really find you could justify it by Scripture, then you must be an exception. That's kind of how the logic went. You don't hear that kind of argument today. At least I haven't for a very long time. Now the revisionist position has been accepted as normal, and so it's not even really discussed. Interestingly, and this I think is true in many denominations, the original legislation was very determinedly supposed to be permissive. It would never be prescriptive upon anybody to accept women's ordination. It would never be an issue in your candidacy if you didn't agree with it, and so on. Today, there are very, very few things that would get you disciplined as a minister in the Church of Scotland today, and one of them would probably be standing up and saying you disagreed with women's ordination. You might just be disciplined for a sexual misdemeanor with a woman. You need to have it with a man, and then you're safe. Very, very few churches, and maybe none now, but certainly in recent years, very, very few churches would have still had an all-male eldership, and those that had, like our own, were very greatly harassed constantly. And every time we would have our quinquennial, our 5-yearly visitation from Presbytery, where they'd look at all your work and all that's going on, the only thing that ever got really mentioned in the report to the Presbytery was this church does not have women's elders. And there'd be a great furore and brouhaha about that. So revival could be breaking out, but that's of no consequence. But that is an important thing to note, because exactly the same language is being used today over the issues to do with gay ordination. Our assembly has, my former assembly has agreed to have all of that, but it will never be prescriptive. No church would ever be forced to do it, etc., 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 etc. All the same assurances. So today, more than 25% of our parish ministers are female. For elders in the church, it is well over half are women, and for other office bearers, it's well over 2/3 are women. So last time I was at a General Assembly, which was a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, it felt like pretty much equal numbers of men and women at the Assembly. Of course, in our congregations, that is definitely not the case. Women vastly predominate. Again, every time we had one of these quinquennial visitations, one or two of the folk we were visiting always said the first thing when they came to our service on a Sunday, "My goodness, you've got all these men." I could look around and think, what are you talking about? Men and women here? But I realized that in their churches there were hardly any men. And probably 80 to 90% female would be the kind of average makeup in one of our average parish churches today in Scotland. That's not a hard figure, that's a guesstimate, but I don't think that would be too far wrong. Now, of course, it's always very difficult to show cause and effect. Are there more women in ministry just because there are more women in the churches proportionately? Well, that, no doubt, I'm sure is part of it. But it does seem to me, from observation, that increasing numbers of women in leadership, especially in the pulpit, does seem to lead to a reduced number of men in the congregation. I don't think you need to really even think theologically about that. I think you just need to look at the way things are. Mostly speaking, men don't really want to join in events that are just for women. That's just the way men are. There's been a lot of stuff in our press over the last few years about the last bastions of male-only membership organisations. So the RNA, the Royal and Ancient Golfing Society of St Andrews, eventually caved into pressure and has to have women members. But the Garrick Club in London is still holding out. They just had a recent vote, and so the papers a few weeks ago were absolutely full of this, and there's a great feminist lobby determined to have women members at the Garrick Club. But the interesting thing is that in recent years there have been a whole lot of women's-only clubs opened in London. There's no male lobby desperate to get membership of those. I think that's just a fact of life. And the implications of these trends are certainly concerning in the churches. Again, I don't think you need theology to tell you, just need statistics. We know, don't we? Everybody knows that if a man is converted, then a very high proportion of the time his wife and his children will come to Christ and come to the church. And it's not so vice versa. And so if men are not being brought into the church, then eventually that is going to mean that women too are not going to be brought into the church with them or children. And certainly the observable truth, I think, in Scotland today is that by and large our churches have become feminized. They are increasingly denuded of men. Well, that's a sort of bird's eye view, if you like, of the national church. But I'd also like to offer some personal observations because I want to talk about the dynamics in a congregation where the senior minister is a woman. And I've got first-hand experience of that because I was placed as a probationer minister, as an assistant minister in a parish with a woman minister. So I can talk with a certain degree of knowledge of that. In 1997 to 1998, I did that. I had been, in my final year at college, a student minister assistant to William Still in Aberdeen, who was really the great father of our evangelical movement in Scotland. And so because of that, well, how shall I put it? The church authorities considered that I needed a bit of broadening out of my education, that's what we say. I never found anybody who needed a bit of narrowing, but quite a lot of us needed a bit of broadening out. So one thing and another, various possibilities were put before me, none of which I could possibly do. And so it ended up that I was to be assistant in this parish where there was a lady minister, and we agreed on that. The church was in a council estate, but quite near the university. It had quite a long history of, I suppose, a broadly evangelical ministry, I think a good ministry. Had a mix of locals from that quite deprived area, some students. Quite a number of international students were housed in the council housing in that area near the university, so there were a number of them. And it was quite an unusual mix, actually, for a parish church in Scotland. The previous minister had moved away a few years previously, and this evangelical lady had taken over. She had been at one time a social worker, was trained as a social worker, then had worked in a church elsewhere in a kind of social work role in a similar type of house, a church in a housing scheme with lots of deprivation and needs and so on. And I think had been an effective worker there. The minister that she had been under was, I suppose, a charismatic evangelical man who was quite pro-women's ordination, and had supported her into going into ordained ministry. By the way, when I say ordained ministry, I mean as a presbyter. That's in our situation, that's what it means. Interestingly, that particular minister, who's now retired, is how shall I put it? He's been one of those most vocal against churches like ours that have taken a strong stand against the current press for homosexual unions in the Church of Scotland. And no, I won't say any more of that, but it's perhaps an interesting thing. It was a little awkward when I went to that church. The lady in question had also previously been a member of the church that my father was minister of in Edinburgh, and he had not been supportive of her going into ordained ministry, so it was a little awkward. But she was a very kind and faithful person. She was certainly evangelical. It seemed to me that her view of being a pastor was really being a social worker with a dog collar on. And the church under her seemed to me to be becoming increasingly demasculinized. The session clerk, which is our sort of senior organizing elder, it was a woman. The clerk to the congregational board, which is the sort of looks after the temporal affairs, the money and the fabric and thing, was a woman. Most of the elders were women. And the church as a whole reflected that. And over a period of years, sadly, the congregation declined. Eventually, she moved on back into a parachurch ministry with with international students, which she was very good at. But sadly, the next minister that they called was a complete out-and-out liberal. Now, of course, you can't attribute the decline of a church really to the minister's sex. That would be foolish. Of course, plenty of churches with male ministers are declining and so on and so on. So that's not what I'm saying. But just let me offer a few observations. Many of the men who did remain in that congregation were very feeble men. They weren't robust, masculine men. They certainly were not men who could draw any other men into the church. That's just an observation. There were very few men, as I said, on the eldership, and those men who were there in the meetings just cut their head down, looked at their feet, and never said a thing. And the women just dominated the meeting. That's just an observation. Men in the parish considered the church as a place for women and children. So when I would go out visiting, I'd often be sent out with a list of people to go and visit. Ring the doorbell, knock on the door. If a bloke came to the door, what was the first thing he said to me? Oh, the wife's not in. I was most surprised when I said, well, I haven't come to see her, I've come to speak to you. What's it got to do with me? It's the church. And that was just the assumption. And the problem was, if ever any of the men did come to church, then that view was kind of strengthened, because that's what it looked like to them, a place for women and kids. And non-Christian men were put off. They didn't really want to come at all. And you know how difficult it is to get men to church anyway. I found I was a bit of a problem because although I did try very hard not to undermine my boss in any way, I was only there for 18 months. I didn't consider it my place to rock the boat or change anything. But the awkward thing was that I just found that people tended to come to me and look to me for leadership, even though I was quite young. That just seemed to be the way people thought it ought to be, and it was quite difficult. And the contrast became quite obvious to some, and I think they realized that the leadership dynamic was at least part of the problem. And over the piece, quite a number of, perhaps the majority of really the best folk ended up moving away and going to other churches. The end result, sadly, the long and the short of it in the end, is that as far as I know, I think that church is barely alive. There really is no gospel there at all. Now, please, again, let me just say, don't mishear me. I don't attribute all of that at all to the sex of the senior minister, but I find it difficult, given the experience that I had there and have seen. I do find it difficult not to feel that it was at least a significant and quite major factor in the church as a whole. So let me just give some reflections on that whole situation in the Church of Scotland. I think one of the problems that we've had has been the traditional pattern of our Presbyterian church polity. In Scotland, it really was traditionally one minister, a body of ordained elders, traditionally all men. And to be honest, that did make it really quite difficult for women who wanted to be involved in active ministry positions to find a real place. I think it hindered a proper development of women's ministry. Really, the only place that women could serve was on the congregational board. That was the kind of dealing with fabric and finance. I always found the congregational board aptly named because the meetings bored me absolutely stupid and not a very fulfilling thing. So there were no obvious places really for women with particular ministry gifts in that setup. And so it's not surprising that liberals lobbied for equality. Good evangelical women, well, they either went to the mission field, where it seemed that a lot of these things were quite acceptable, that weren't acceptable at home, or, as I said, they felt their call overrode their understanding of Scripture, so they became ordained to the presbyterate as exceptions. So I think that was a problem we've got to be honest about, and did us harm. But having gone that way then of ordaining women to the presbyterate, I think that further shut off options for women who wanted to be in ministry but not to be ordained to the presbyterate. Because after you have ordained women to the presbyterate, well, there's really no appetite at all for non-ordained positions. That would be seen to be demeaning, that would be second rate, that's selling the pass and so on. So in a sense, after we had ordination of women, I think the situation got even worse for those with a biblical complementarian view. And the truth is that in Scotland today, certainly in the Church of Scotland, there are very, very few team ministries. Even now, there are very few ministry positions for women. There are a few deaconess roles, but not many. Some youth jobs. But I would say today, probably very few churches in Scotland, especially Presbyterian ones, have real roles for women in ministry, fulfilling real feminine roles. And I think that's a problem. And I would just flag it up as a warning, because I think as soon as the door is opened for ordination of women to the clergy without any distinction of role from men, I think anything else is seen as something less and second rate, and I don't think there's any way back from that. That's what we've seen, I think. I think our experience is that has killed development of the very kinds of ministry for women that the church really needs if it's going to have women hard at work alongside men for the gospel, but as women, not as surrogate men, and doing the things that men can't do as well as women can do. I think we've been hindered very greatly by the route that we've taken. Well, that's the Church of Scotland. You can ask me anything you like about that later. Second, I'd like to give, hopefully a bit more positively, some reflections from my years in London with the Proclamation Trust. We moved to London in 1999. Wasn't too keen to do it at first, but anyway, one thing or other, it's a long story. We ended up in London working with the Proclamation Trust, where I was Director of Ministry. It was a transition time. The Proclamation Trust had been set up some years earlier by Dick Lucas when he was still the rector at St Helens in London. He had now retired and gave himself the ministry of the Proclamation Trust. But by the time I started, Dick was withdrawing himself. He'd been effectively the director of it and the chairman of the trust, but he was stepping back a bit. So quite why they brought in a kind of foreign Scots Presbyterian into that situation to come and help, I think, I'm not entirely sure. But there maybe was some purpose in it. For me, it was a very interesting transition to really quite a foreign culture and a foreign church culture. It's probably rather like we think everything in Australia is all the same. You probably think everything in the UK is just all the same, but really there's a big cultural difference between Scotland and England, and certainly in the kind of church culture. English culture is, I think, still very bound up with a historic sort of class system and understanding of these things, whereas it's really quite different. You know, we're the people of Rabbie Burns, where a man's a man for all that, and I guess that's probably quite Australian as well. But these things are also tied up with ecclesiastical history and ecclesiastical politics in England, and quite bound up with the differences between Anglicanism and the free churches in England. The Church of England is still, or certainly among the clergy, is a high proportion of those who are kind of upper middle class, public school, Oxbridge, and that's just much less so in the free churches. I was a complete outsider with nobody's particular tribe, and in some ways that was somewhat helpful. It was a time when we were genuine, I think, making progress in building real partnerships across some of these historic divides, and again, that's another whole story. But sometimes when you come as an outsider, it's very interesting. You look at things in a different way. You maybe see things that are not so easy to see when you're in the midst of it all. I was very struck by a number of things. I was very struck by the quality and the number of young men in training for ministry compared with Scotland. Most of them were Anglican. Many of them had come from a system of public school camps, which have been highly effective in evangelizing and mentoring young men from some of the top private schools in England. There was great strength to that movement, but the other side of it is there was a kind of elitism inherent in it, which was quite resented by others. Part of that, and related to our topic, was that I think it's probably fair to say that not a few of these guys in training for ministry had not had in their life very much dealing with women. A lot of them had been at boys-only boarding schools. They'd gone on straight from there to universities. They'd been mentored by a kind of follow-on organization, which was really quite determined in keeping men and women really quite separate, and actually to the point of often discouraging any kind of connection or thoughts of marriage, at least for a long time, because it would get in the way of your proper development. That's what I've been told by those who were part of that. So that was interesting. I was also struck by the fact that there were many more women in ministry and in training for ministry. There were a lot of larger churches, much larger churches, particularly in the big cities and London and so on. You've got to remember that Scotland's got a population of only 5.5 million. There's twice that number just in London. So you've got bigger churches, bigger everything. But also, it seemed to me that the Anglican polity, in particular, I think, seemed to have more structures where women could be involved in PCCs and all sorts of things. And that just seemed to be part of what allowed more opportunities for women and a bit of a better mix. Anyway, I was involved with running the organisation of the Proclamation Trust. We ran Cornhill training course. We had a kind of audio and resources ministry. And we ran a lot of conferences, about 10 or 12 conferences a year, mostly for people in ministry or training for ministry and ministry wives. Everybody probably knows about the Evangelical Ministry Assembly. That's a great big conference, but actually all these other residential conferences were really where the more important work in many ways was done. So I'd just like to give some observations on two of those conferences. The first is the Women in Ministry Conference. I think that conference started newly the year that I joined PT, but I had so many conferences, they all run into one, I can hardly remember. But certainly at the beginning, it was a very small conference. There was about 20 women who were in mostly full-time, some in part-time ministry. And some of them had previously come along to one of the two younger ministers conferences, which was for kind of curates and assistant ministers. But they had lobbied to have something of their own because they felt they were just a bit of a kind of add-on to the Blokes Conference, which in fact was exactly true. So we started this conference, and it was held in a very nice little conference centre down in East Sussex, which was a very nice place to go. And I really enjoyed that conference, not just because it was a lovely centre, but it was very interesting observing the differences. There was none of the rivalry or ambition that was on offer at the Younger Men's Ministers' Conference, where that was a hotbed of a lot of ambitious young men all jockeying with each other for position. Another thing I greatly valued and noted was that there was real appreciation from the women of the ministry that they received at the conference. They hadn't come to the conference just to criticize the speaker's theology or point out how they'd missed something important in the text or whatever else it was. They actually come to have their souls fed. and be helped in their ministry, and that was rather refreshing. When we talked about work, and this was a lovely conference centre, a converted Oast house, and we used to go upstairs and sit in this lovely big lounge in the evening with a big fire, and people would share and talk about their ministry. And when the women talked about their work, they talked all the time about people and about relationships. And not just about plans and aspirations and achievements and things and the next thing and all the rest of it. It was quite a marked difference to me. It seemed to me that most of the women at the conference were being enabled to have really quite significant ministry roles, ranging from youth work to dealing with young people, students. There were some older ladies who were in a variety of different ministry and caring roles. It was a great feature of the conference that some of these more mature, experienced women were sharing with the younger ones, and it was really very good. I think I got some insight into some of the areas in ministry that they felt were issues for them. I think perhaps there were some things that I observed that I also thought were issues for them. One thing was that certainly some senior ministers saw the women on their team as a dumping ground for problems and a dumping ground for problem women. It was a bit like where you have an all-male GP practice and a woman comes in and gets dumped with all the obstetrics and gynae and all the kind of women's issues because they don't want to deal with them. There was a bit of that in some of these ministry positions. I think some senior ministers were definitely very poor at relating to women in general, perhaps related to their background and so on, what I said earlier. But they thought the solution for that was, well, we'll get a women's worker. But the problem there was they were poor at relating to their women's worker. We laugh, but some of them, it meant they were working in a situation where they were really not getting good support, and it was quite difficult, really. And certainly for some of them, that was a real issue. Another interesting thing was that there were only certain men who could cope with speaking at the Women's in Ministry Conference. Some guys asked to come, they absolutely no chance. There were some guys who came who the feedback was, please let's not have them again. There were only some guys who seemed to be able to connect and go down with the women. And I think that whole issue of the way the senior pastor relates to women is quite a key thing. I might come back to that. One thing I noted was that some of the women seemed to me very caught up, in fact, overly caught up with the boundaries of what was a properly biblical role for them, and really quite sort of anxious about it, almost to the state where it was really quite artificial and unnatural. So they'd be full of questions. Is it right for me to do this? Is it okay for me to do that? A whole list of sort of things, individual things, rather than looking at the more overall pattern of their role within the church, their whole place within the team and so on. And that was certainly something that was talked about a lot in some of those early conferences. I think another major issue which I would have to mention is that of singleness and marriage. More than 90%, certainly in my time, more than 90% of the women at the Women in Ministry Conference were single. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, and in some ways, maybe it was inevitable, really, particularly for those who were in full-time roles, unless there were married women who had grown-up children and so on. But it does raise issues because although I certainly don't think singleness is an inferior state, I hope nobody does, on the other hand, it's not the norm in the church or in life. And I think there is a need, and was a need among some for care, so that it wasn't seen, the message wasn't given across that it was a more exalted state for the truly dedicated Christian woman, the real gospel worker. And I think there have been sometimes difficulties in pitting marriage against ministry in that regard. That may not be something that's been an issue here, I don't know. But I have come across a number of issues relating to that, and one was, for example, I heard of a situation where a youth leader who was single was kind of over-promoting singleness to the girls in her youth. And in that church there was quite a bit of difficulty and upset caused among parents who complained to the pastor that, look, it seems that all our girls are being taught that the real way of godliness is singleness. Now that may be an unusual thing. I don't think it's just a one-off thing, but I think it's an issue that I've observed. Another thing that I have observed and experienced is that sometimes when a single woman has been on a church team for a longer time, it can seem to make marriage a more and more remote possibility. And I think there are some reasons possibly for that. And again, this may be a very different thing in Australia. I don't know. There are differences of people in Australia. Young people in Australia seem to get married much, much earlier. In Britain now today, the average age at which people get married is getting later and later and later. And I think that may be another factor. But I have observed, and others have observed and said to me, that men can be easily scared off from a professional woman who's perceived to be a professional minister on a church team. And some have said to me, I don't think I could give a lead if I were to be a husband to her, because she's so much more knowledgeable than me and knows more theology than me and all this kind of thing. Now, that may be a wrong view, that may be a wrong way to look at things, I think it is, but that's the way that some blokes feel. And it's not an issue, I don't think, for women who are working Christian ministry in parachurch things, because when they're in the church, they're just a normal person like everybody else. But for those who are perceived to be professional leaders in the church, that's certainly something that we have seen. We've also seen, and I've certainly seen this, that a woman in ministry on a church team can be looking for a bloke who measures up and really could lead her spiritually. And the problem is on her side, because she is measuring a man by her particular standards and looking at things from her knowledge of ministry and being in ministry and all the rest of it, and therefore feels, well, that guy, I don't think he could really be a proper husband, a proper leading Christian husband to me. Now, I've seen one case of that, and I think the issue was she didn't realize that he was a man, not a woman. She was, I mean, I do know she did realize he was a man. You understand what I'm saying? But she was judging by the criteria which she would judge another woman by, and not another man. Now, you may feel all of that's ridiculous, but that's just things that I've seen and observed, and others have too, and quite why it is like that, I'm not entirely sure, but that's there. And it can, if that is the case, that can lead to disappointment. It can lead to resentment. It can lead to bitterness, and even sometimes to worse. I was speaking to one of my colleagues who works with me in Cornhill, who was a minister in the Church of England for 30 years. And he told me that over his time he had a whole succession of women's workers on his staff. And two of them, he said, that was a real issue. And it led to a lot of bitterness and so on. And the end result for those two was they both ended up in same-sex relationships. And that was his experience. When I was at the Proclamation Trust, Heather Jackman, David Jackman's wife, David was the director of Cornhill from the beginning until Christopher Ashe took over. Heather used to spend a lot of time with the girls in Cornhill, and one of the things that she would do was to say, look, to the girls, if you really want to be married, and that is definitely what you want your future to be, then don't go full-time on a church staff team unless you're absolutely clear of all of these things. And she would advise girls to go part-time and keep their other job or whatever it was they were doing, just in an effort to keep them as a normal girl as well as a professional minister girl. Now, you may think differently from that, but Heather Jackman's quite a shrewd woman, and she was doing it out of concern because she'd seen that happening. Another thing that Heather and another lady in the PT office used to do is they would feel that some of the girls in ministry were being a bit over-literalistic in their interpretation of 1 Peter 3. You know, the whole bit about clothes and adorning and all that sort of stuff. And they felt that there was a bit of a tendency towards frumpiness in women who were in ministry. And they wanted to tell the girls, look, you don't have to be asexual. You need to be feminine. And you need to be aware of that. And you need to be not trying to downplay that. I can tell that I'm skating on kind of fairly thin ice here. But I thought it was best to just be honest and straight. And I'm telling you what I've seen, and I'm telling you what I've heard, and you can throw the tomatoes at me afterwards. But another issue that I saw with women in full-time ministry is to do with the passage of time and the evolution of their role. For example, take youth workers. Many men who are young men who are youth workers will go on ultimately to become pastors eventually, and various other things in ministry. That could be a lot harder for women. The future, where it's all going to go, where the long term is. It might seem natural for women doing that to kind of move on more naturally into from youth and children's work, perhaps, to dealing with ministry among women more generally. I have found, and others have found, that it's not necessarily the easiest thing for women to do that, especially single women, in terms of ministering among married women with families and so on. For some it's fine, but certainly for others that's been a difficulty. Some women in ministry that I've known have done very, very well and function very, very well in the sort of teacher-pupil role, but not so easily in the kind of equal role with other women of their own age, or particularly perhaps with older women. And I've also found that some of the women in the churches can feel a bit intimidated by the women who are professional ministers, because they feel a bit inferior, a bit less kind of skilled and knowledgeable, and that can put them a bit of a distance. Now again, these are things that need not be, but they're just issues that were there. These are the kind of things that were sometimes being discussed at these conferences. So we have numbers of girls, women coming through our Cornhill program in Scotland, which is just exactly the same as the London one. It's a full-time course over 2 years. And one of the things I'm doing sometimes is trying to help them find places to go and work and minister. And I feel, because of all of these things I've seen, I feel a certain weight of responsibility. So I tend to say a number of things to them. The first is, I say, be very careful where you go to work. If your senior minister doesn't really relate to women, if he thinks the solution is to get you, don't go. Because it's very unlikely you're going to get the kind of support that you need. I believe very firmly that any woman on a staff team is there to complement the ministry of the senior pastor and others. I believe that the pastor is the pastor to the whole flock, not just the rams, also the ewes and the lambs. Women on your staff team are not there to replace an absent ministry to women from the men, but are there to complement that and complement that ministry to the flock. So I warn them very clearly to ask careful questions about that. I also say to them, as part of a ministry team, be there as a woman, not just as an honorary bloke. Because I think that can be a pressure on girls on a team, especially if they're the only one. I also do say to them that if you really do want marriage, that I think you have to consider at least the possibility that longer term working on a church team may present some obstacles to that. So I ask them to think hard about that first. And I also say that I think you need to think hard about how you portray yourself to men if you're in that role, and you need to be aware of some of these difficulties and think about it. And then if we have a senior minister somewhere that I know and they're taking on a woman, especially if she is one of ours, then I impress upon them the importance of them considering all of these issues and trying to be as helpful as possible and to minimize some of these difficulties. And then I usually say to them, if you don't look after her, I'll come around and bash your face in. That's kind of just normal Glasgow speak. So, but I do that because I want to make them think, because I've known folk who have been treated really badly and left in a mess. So that's some things that, just from my observations for the Women in Ministry Conference, might get even deeper water now. The other conference I want to talk about is the Ministers' Wives Conferences that we had. Noting some of the different dynamics that were operating there and some of the very different ways that I observed that those partnerships could work very successfully in enhancing ministry or conversely, sometimes hindering effective ministry. Being involved in conferences for ministers' wives is extremely revealing. We had two conferences, not so much the one for the younger wives, those were guys who were still in training or early curacies, but the Senior Wives Conference. We had to be very careful even what we called the conference, you see. You couldn't call it the Older Wives Conference, because that would be really, so it was quite delicate. But of course, that was a conference of men who were in senior ministry positions, and as you would expect, it reflected the struggles, the stresses, the difficulties of ministry life. Day one of those conferences, when everybody was arriving, was quite something. In the hall there at Hothorpe Hall, there'd be great shrieks and hugs and just cacophonous, endless talking, 19 to the dozen, women bursting into tears all over the place, hugging each other, rushing around. Even for a fairly emotional Celt, it was pretty high octane stuff for me. But it was fascinating over the years to meet the wives of the men who I got to know quite well in various conferences and ministry contexts and so on. And again, there were very many able and excellent women at the conferences, but there were also not a few quite frustrated, quite unhappy, and quite dissatisfied ministers' wives at these conferences. There were some who I could see would be absolutely terrific to have as a wife in ministry, and there were others that, well, let's just say I went home very thankful for my own wife sometimes from the conference. Dick Lucas will be 90 next month. He's been a lifelong bachelor. I'm going to his birthday party on the 10th of September. But as a lifelong bachelor, I've met few people who are as insightful and perceptive with women and very sensitive to women. Nearly every Monday morning when I would go into the office, Dick would come and see me at coffee time, and almost always among the questions he would ask me was, "Are you loving your wife?" I began to get a bit paranoid actually when he kept asking it every week. I wondered who'd be telling him things, but anyway. And my observations over these years was that very often it seemed to me that the difference between a contented wife with a very fulfilling ministry alongside her husband, between that and a discontented wife, was this, that one was very happy seeing herself principally and primarily as her husband's wife, whereas the other really wanted to be her husband's colleague. Now, when I asked my wife, Rebecca, what she thought of that, whether it was right, she added, yes, or his manager. And that's her, not me, saying that. Now, the latter category, those who wanted to be colleagues, they often talked in terms of our ministry rather than, John's ministry or whatever. They would talk about our leadership of the church rather than his. They would talk about what we're doing, meaning it in very personal terms, not meaning the church, meaning we, the two of us. And they often talked also about their own ministry in a very narrow sense, focusing completely on things like their involvement in the various events they were involved in church life, like maybe leading a Bible study or leading this meeting or that specific thing, rather than, in a more general way, seeing their ministry as being as a wife, as a mother, as a homekeeper, perhaps as a money earner, and all of these other things as well, as all part of the broader aspect of partnership together in ministry. And I came across women whose identity was so bound up with her husband's specific ministry roles that when he had to move to a different parish or whatever, she was absolutely and utterly bereaved by the loss of her ministry because he had moved, to the extent that sometimes it led to real bitterness, real damage. By contrast, I would have to say that I found that the wives who were the happiest were those who tend to talk in terms of my husband's ministry. They saw themselves in partnership in ministry. Of course they did, but not as a work colleague, not as an assistant minister, but as a lover, as a wife, as a friend, as a mother, as all of these other things, as serving as part of the church family, along with others, not as if they themselves were in part the pastor. Now again, these are just my observations and reflections. They may just be idiosyncratic, but we are shaped by our experience. That's just the way things are. And in my personal experience of ministry, I'd have to say this, and I grew up in a ministry home. I grew up in a church that was a training church that put out many dozens of pastors over the years. So I have known people going out into ministry all my life and observed them. One of the biggest causes of ministry being stifled and damaged, in fact, I think the biggest cause that I have seen of ministries being stifled and damaged and just being far less than they could have been, or in fact ruined altogether, the biggest cause, in my experience, has been marriage issues. And I don't mean marital unfaithfulness, although there has been that, sadly, but thankfully not much. Not that, but just because along with all the normal, stresses and strains in any marriage, ministry does bring very specific issues, very specific strains. And if there is discontent in a ministry spouse, then I think that inevitably leads to problems. That's what I've seen. Now, of course, issues can arise on both sides, absolutely. But there is a category of women that I call an HMW, a high-maintenance wife. There are plenty of high-maintenance husbands, of course there are, so I'm not being discriminate. But no sane man will be blessed by a wife who is an HMW. But in ministry, that will lead to a train wreck, in my experience. In ministry, a pastor needs a low-maintenance wife. He needs a wife who will put up with all kinds of things, lots of evenings out, lots of time devoted to other people, lack of boundaries around your work and your life, and all sorts of things, all kinds of things that are really hard to deal with And if a minister's wife resists that, so that it becomes a tug of war between her possession of her husband and the congregation's possession, that's a disaster. And I've learned that by experience. I've seen it time and again, and it's just a fact. And you can disbelieve me, but in my world, it's a fact. So I've known guys in ministry when they were single in ministry, and they were terrific, and they got married, and it just all went to complete disaster. Sometimes, because it was an HMW who couldn't cope with ministry, but sometimes it wasn't the wife at all. Sometimes it was that the man couldn't cope with the complication of life that being married added to his ministry. He could cope when all he had to focus on was his ministry, but he got married and he could no longer cope. And I can think of one person like that who got married to an excellent woman who was in no way a high maintenance wife, a terrific lady. But he just couldn't cope any longer with all the complexity of keeping all these relationships, which is a difficult thing in pastoral ministry. So what I say to our younger men in training for ministry is I say to them, you have to look for a low maintenance wife. You need that kind of wife, or you have no wife. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not, repeat, not advocating ministers who neglect their wives. All right? Let me just say this again. I am not advocating ministers to neglect their wives. That happens too. And that's why Dick Lucas used to say to me every Monday, are you loving your wife? And that's what I say to other men as well. But those are just facts. I say to women who are getting married to somebody who's a pastor or training to be a pastor, I say you need to be a low-maintenance wife if this is going to work. You need to find joy and pride in sharing your husband with many people, many others, not resenting that. You need to be able to live without boundaries in home life and in work life and so on. You need to see the privilege of all the things you're gaining by that, not the things you're losing. You need to be happy that he is the pastor and the leader, and that that's his ministry, and that's not your ministry. And you don't need to try and usurp it, especially where you think you could do a better job than him. And you need to not undermine it. You need to not resent it. You need to help him do that better, not hinder. And if you think I'm very bold and direct, I haven't always been, but I have become bolder and I've become more direct as I have seen all kinds of things coming unstuck before me in the past. And I don't want to see that. So you may think it's a good thing I'm going back to Scotland soon and you won't ever see me again. Okay, last, and then I'll finish. Just some thoughts from my experience as minister in the Tron. We went back to Scotland in 2004. We were very happy in London. We loved it there, but I was called back to the Tron Church. Actually, in 2004, I remember watching the European Football Championships, and I remember watching England play Croatia and jumping up and cheering when Wayne Rooney scored 2 goals against them. And I thought, my goodness, it's time I got back to Scotland. Really, this could go horribly wrong if I stay any longer. From the start of my time in Glasgow, I've been blessed with really great female staff. When I arrived, we had a lady administrator who'd taken early retirement from a professional job. She was in her mid-50s then. She's in her mid-60s now. She's still with us. She tried to retire twice, but we won't let her because I need her. We had an associate minister who moved on fairly shortly, and we just had two ministry staff, an evangelist and a youth and children's worker, a girl who was, in fact, a Scot who had been at Cornhill in London and whom I'd actually helped get the job back in Glasgow. She was looking to move back to Scotland and came to see me, and I said, well, it's probably one of the few places there might be a job for you. So I was rewarded a year later when I went back and she was on the staff. Over the years, we've developed a larger team. With Cornhill starting, we've had more trainees and apprentices and so on. They come to us on a 2-year program, 2 days a week study at Cornhill, 4 days a week with us at the church. Because of the Cornhill setup, we've had a slightly odd arrangement because we've got three senior full-time teachers at Cornhill, three senior clergymen, Edward Lobb, Bob File, and then latterly Andy Gemmell. They're all honorary associate ministers with us. So we're quite top-heavy with senior preachers. So in terms of our church staff, there's myself. We have four full-time ministry staff, 2 men and 2 women. We have one of our elders who works for us 3 or 4 days a week, unpaid, but essentially full-time. And he kind of acts as a bit of a chief of staff, really. We have our administrator lady and another secretary. Currently, we have 2 ministers in training. We have no theological college now, so we have to do everything ourselves. So after 2 years of Cornhill, we have another 3-year program called the Pastor's Training Course, where guys are working as assistant ministers and doing continuing training. And then we usually have about 6 apprentices. So of our 2 permanent women's staff, one is a really youth and children's worker. She does other things too with students and girls and so on. And the other really works a lot among internationals. She's a great evangelist, does all kinds of different things among different women. But actually our senior lady who's an administrator is much, much more than administrator. She really does have a very important pastoral role. She knows everybody. She particularly knows all the older folk, particularly the women in the congregation, and that's a very key part of our ministry, very valued. Just in terms of what our female staff do and don't do, in terms of specifics, they don't lead or teach in our main services. They don't want to, and we don't want that. Also, I want to protect them from this whole perception of appearing as professional or any distanced in any way, and there is an aspect of that. One in particular, though, is extremely sharp theologically, a very good teacher. She doesn't just teach the young folk, therefore we have her teaching and doing instruction in our Student and Young Workers program. I would distinguish, I think, between preaching and teaching with authority to the church and instructing people about how to handle the Bible and how to read it and how to do it and so on. So she'll do some of that among the students. I also get her to crit the talks and sermons of our apprentices, male and female, because she is much tougher on them than I am, and they need that, and she's very good at it. So she'll do that with them in their early years. The other one is brilliant with internationals, but our internationals ministry is increasingly, in recent years, we've got lots of men, particularly Iranian men coming, so there are all kinds of issues there culturally and all sorts of things. So Katie needs lots of male leaders too. She'll coordinate the ministry, but we need a lot of men, and we especially find we need older men. We need men with grey hairs for these guys. They won't listen to them otherwise. So it's been a growth industry in some of our newly retired men. They found a great niche in mentoring these young Iranians. But as part of the team, when we're kind of doing things together, there's no distinction. We all just muck in our team meetings. Everybody has an equal voice. We alternate our team meetings just with senior staff, and then every second week we have all the apprentices and everybody. When it's just the staff, it's sort of usually, I think, 6 male and 3 female. When we have the apprentices, it's maybe 9 guys and 6 girls. So it's all in together. And I think there are great pluses in that. We have much more balanced discussions, all kinds of perspectives. It's quite a contrast between that and our elders meetings, which is all men, and it's very interesting. I find that the female members of our team bring us great sensitivity to congregational issues. The women actually know what people are thinking about things because they talk to each other, but the blokes don't talk to each other about things like that anyway, and that's a real help. If we need bellwethers in our congregation, then I always go to the women because they know, and the blokes are oblivious. It's always said that women are much better at multitasking. I find that to be absolutely true in our ministry staff team. That's for definite, and it's a huge help for us. The other thing that is our female staff are more experienced because a lot of the men pass through and go on to through training to other jobs, and those who've been with us longest are the women. And in particular, our administrator, as senior pastor, I find having a senior, experienced woman like that at the heart of the life of the congregation, absolutely invaluable. That's why I won't let her retire. It's a very close relationship. We can discuss things confidentially. She knows my diary. She knows all the stuff that we're doing. She knows what I'm thinking. We can bounce ideas off. She'll speak very plainly to me. She's totally loyal to me. Will not criticize me to others, but behind closed doors, she will tell me what's what. And but it's a very clear working relationship. I wouldn't have a woman my own age in that position. I wouldn't want it to be a man, though. It has to be a woman, because she brings a whole lot of other side of things that a man wouldn't. Just one or two issues to finish. All of our staff, as I've said, are single. I've mentioned various things to do with that. I suppose it seems inevitable in that if they're full-time and longer term and so on, that's just the way it seems to be. I've also mentioned that our polity, our official decision-making body, our session, is all male. Although the truth is that in practice it is our staff team that has a lot of the input in terms of the direction of the ministry and so on. So we have women's input there, and also our administrator lady sits in on our elders meetings, and so we do have female influence there, and we dissect things afterwards. There is a little bit of a danger, and this is just true of any church with a staff team, is that some of the women in the congregation can sometimes feel a bit inferior because they don't feel I can't do that sort of thing that these girls on the staff do. But I don't think that's a big problem with us. My wife is not an upfront person at all. She does not like giving talks and doing things like that. In fact, other senior guys' wives are the same. So it's quite plain to people that those are not things that are the things that give women their value, at least in our eyes. And I hope that our church is a church where men and women really are happily working together. I think they are, side by side, in all kinds of different ways. There's hardly an area of church life, I think, where we don't have that. I think women being on the staff does help that dynamic, because it helps the staff. But I think it's visible to the whole church that men and women work together for the gospel at every part of church life, including on the paid staff. I wouldn't like to have it any other way. I think it's the way that works best for us. I mean, the irony is that when we were constantly being vilified by the Church of Scotland for not having women, you don't have what you're against women. We got far more women working in all kinds of ways in our church than almost any of these who are criticising us, most of whom we have none at all. And we find the same thing actually with the whole homosexual issue. Most of the people who are criticising us for being homophobic have never met a gay person in their congregations at all. And we have a number of people who are who struggle with these things in our church. So I'm thrilled to have women on our team. The women we have are terrific. Whether they would say the same about us, I'm not sure. I think so. I think it's a happy team. But those are just some of my observations, and I'll stop.
We've got a few minutes until there's some supper downstairs, so there's an opportunity for you to ask some questions if you'd like, and here's the moment. You are asking about the biblical principles and narrowing in on biblical principles and making a stand on those principles, and is a failure at that area why people are in the sort of mess that they're in?
You could say it, Mark, far more concisely.
Yes. I mean, it's another whole thing to get into looking at all the biblical justification of it, but I think the pattern that is taught in the New Testament simply applies to ministry from the analogy of the family, the pattern that is there from creation, right the way through. I think the Bible teaches a clear complementarian position. That's my view. I think we're where we are. Yes, because of a lack of teaching that, but not only that, because that's just the negative. That's just, what women can't do. And as I was trying to just indicate from our some of the issues about our polity and so on, is that I think some of it is that women have been forced into something they didn't really want to do, because no opportunity was given of a positive role for women. And I think that's a problem as well. So yes, we maybe haven't taught it clearly, but I don't think we've necessarily thought through then, well, if it can't be this, then what can it be? And I gather that's part of what the whole of this Priscilla Aquila is here to do.
Could I follow on that question just for a moment and ask, when you want to encourage women to delight in being women in ministry, where do you point people to think? What kind of things do you want people to, what you want women to actually appreciate about being a woman, and the difference in being a woman to being a man in ministry?
Yeah. Well, I think it's difficult to summarize that, really. We live in a culture that is just so, the air we breathe is just so full of the whole egalitarian equality model. I think it's just we're increasingly forced into a mold of thinking asexually, and I think that's one of the big problems. I think it's about being unashamed of masculinity and femininity, and not trying to squash it all into some sort of unisex. Because I think the problem in our culture is we're de-manning men as well as de-womening women. So I think it is to be unashamed about the differences in the sexes, and I think there's a whole load of things. I think it's difficult because of the milieu that we're in to even talk positively about. That's why I mentioned the thing about motherhood, for example, because it's very difficult to talk about that positively today, because feminists often will just immediately jump down your throat and want to just assume that is somehow a demeaning thing and all the rest of it. But that's something the Bible talks up. So I think there are all kinds of things that we need to be unashamed about talking up, and not being, inhibited in saying that men and women are different in lots of ways. And there's no reason why women who want to be having fruitful, successful ministries have to try and become more like men to do it. Men don't want that, and I don't think women want it either. I don't know.
I remember being at a conference once where the great comfort given to a group of young women was to say, you're allowed to be who you are. Yeah. You're allowed to be a woman. Don't let them try to turn you into another man. Yeah. Which was a great piece of advice I heard. Yeah, Peter.
I was going to ask, with people getting converted into the church from our culture, probably very similar. It's a very different worldview.
Yeah.
How do you, is that part of your discipleship, or do you do they pick it up with time? Does that raise any issues?
Yes, it does. Of course it does. I think one of the things that we are seeing a lot is that just so few people now, especially those who are new converts, so few have come from stable family backgrounds. I see it in the couples that are marrying compared to 20 years ago. I would say the majority have come from broken homes and all this kind of thing. So I think we've got a major crisis in terms of understanding not just sexuality, but marriage, family, all of these things. And I think we are finding that things that when I was a student you just didn't have to think about because you assumed, because everybody kind of knew it, we are now having to deal with and tackle in a much more explicit way. So yes, issues about sexuality, issues about masculinity, femininity, all of these things are things that we are now having to deal with. The main place that we would be doing that would be in our Students and Young Workers program. We have another whole issue with internationals and asylum seekers, and at the moment we have about 50 or 60 Iranians in the church, and most of whom don't speak English, so that's another problem. But there's huge cultural differences there, and coming from a culture where men and women are largely separated and wear scarves and all this kind of thing, they come to the West. The women are liberated and are rejoicing and chucking away all these things and becoming snappily dressed women. And the blokes are all hot-blooded young men, and they come and they look at the culture around. Many of them have been converted, but they know nothing. They can't tell the difference between Christian culture and Glaswegian culture, and there's quite a big difference, really, especially on a Saturday night. And that's a big issue for us. So we're having to now suddenly realise we've got to start with ABC about all of these issues with them. But not just them. It's really back to basics with so many of our young folk, and we're just having to things that were once assumed are now completely new to people. That's a generational challenge, because people over about 40 assume a whole lot of things, and people under 20 don't know what you're talking about. That's what we find. I don't know if that's similar here.
So it's how do your meetings work with your women staff? Do you have separate meetings with them or at all, or do they just meet with the men?
Let me just think. I meet with them one-to-one, and we've generally tried to have them having a couple of other women in the church, or certainly one, but usually more than one, that they would meet up with themselves, so they've got somebody as a kind of confidant and mentor and so on. But we don't have a men's staff meeting and a women's staff meeting or anything like that, no.
Do you expect them to tell you who they've been meeting with, answer certain questions, like reviews?
Yeah, we have our sort of senior elder who works with us as a kind of church manager and chief of staff. He will meet with each of our staff every week. Personally, I can't manage to do that as often as that, but he will meet with all of them and our apprentices every week. So the way it works with us, we got to the point where I couldn't cope with it. We had too many different things happening, so they were being neglected, and so he's taken that on. It's been much better. But I meet with them, and we kind of have a sort of open door policy. They know they can meet with me anytime, and that's just the way we do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just for the tape, the relationship of the ministry wife and women's workers within a parish life, and tensions, or how it might work better. Mm-hmm.
It's not an area of problem that I have really come across personally, but I have heard of that being a problem. It may be. I wonder if it's partly to do with the terminology of the women's worker. That we don't call ours that because, in a sense, all of our staff have a kind of specialist role. So they have an area of responsibility. So both of our women, they're not there just to look after the church's women. They're there to be. One does the youth and children's and so on. One is internationals, evangelism, and things. They tend to be involved more with women as well. But it's not. They're the women's workers. So it's not that we look at them as the female half of the congregation and say that's for you. And I think possibly tension may arise in churches where that is the case, and the minister's wife sees that as her kind of territory. Do I have wisdom? I don't know. I'm not so comfortable with the terminology of women's work. I kind of prefer what we do, which is why we do it that way. Just because I think, as I said earlier, I think the danger with that is that it kind of gives the impression that the pastors there are really only interested in the men. And I just don't think that's right. In any given situation, I guess it's going to come down to the people involved and personality and expectations. I think in a lot of roles in ministry, it's not just that one, but in a lot of things, tensions arise where expectations differ, and often those expectations are not articulated. And I think it's a helpful thing to sit down and articulate these and say, what do we expect? What are you actually expecting? What are you expecting? Oh, well, right, okay. Let's try and work this sort of thing out. I've learned that most of my problems have arisen when issues turn up and you just don't want to talk about them because you don't want to open a can of worms. But what I've found is that the can of worms just gets bigger, and one day you have to open it, and then it's a lot more wormy. So just get the can open, get the worms on the table, and have a wriggle.
Do you encourage a relationship between, say, your wife and the women members of your staff, and so they get to know each other and trust each other? That kind of issue.
Yeah, we're quite a largish church, and we're city centre, and people live all over the place, and so it's a little bit different maybe from a suburban parish. Yeah, we do, but I don't think in a sort of particularly exclusive way. I think my wife Rebecca wouldn't see herself as particularly having to have a defined role within the congregation. So she knows them, and we try and spend time together and so on. But it's not a particularly conscious thing. But I can see that maybe in a smaller setup, and if there was one woman on a team and one minister's wife, and there were these kind of issues, then obviously it's a key relationship. Yeah.
So with the styles or things that you've done to encourage men who've been alienated from church because of a feminising of the church to return to church, is that the kind of question you're asking? Good.
Well, our church has lots of men, so men tend to be brought by men. I don't think we've had any particular thing. I mean, in the place where I was assistant that I was talking about, the answer is no, really. It was just very difficult, and because of the way the church was, there was very little that we could easily do, to be honest. I think when you get to that, I think it's very hard. But I think we have about maybe just over 50, just more than 50% women, I think, in our membership. But on an average Sunday, I look around. I don't count, but it just seems to me we're about equal, really. Of course, the girls always say there's no decent men, but there are some men, whether they're decent or not, I don't know.
So addressing the problem of young men in ministry not being able to relate to women, how to help them move forward from that.
Yeah. Well, we have among our apprentices we always have more men, but we always have women, and so I think in our setup I am consciously thinking about that because of my experience, and so from the word go, they're mixing together. They're seeing that our women are honoured and appreciated and so on. I have had the occasional guy who's been a bit full of himself and has kind of thought that they're going to be pastors, and so they're in a slightly different category, and all of our staff have to pull their weight with all kind of dogs bodying jobs. We all just have to muck in. This particular chap seemed to think that he was heading for greater things, and would often not quite pull his weight in that. So when that sort of things arise, I will ask one of our senior women staff to give him a good dressing down, and when he comes and grumbles to me, I'll just tell him that he just kowtows and does exactly what she says. So we just try very hard to make it clear that that's just not the way to be. It's interesting, in our students and young workers thing we call Release the Word, which is for mostly students, and then they can stay on a bit. Most of the time we have our groups mixed, but usually I think one term of the year they'll separate into men's groups and women's groups. But even when they do, they're all mixed. They come for food at 7 or 6:30 or something, and then eat together and do stuff all together as a big group, and then go into smaller groups. So I'm looking to just try and have a kind of natural mixing. I think there are some times where it's helpful. There's certain things, and the leaders have said to me, certain things just work better when we go into same-sex groups, and that's fine. I would personally be uncomfortable if we did that the whole time. But some churches do that all the way through, and I think that helps to perpetuate the problem. I think it's a bit unnatural. I feel quite strongly that the senior pastor and those who are preaching, and I say to our younger guys, you need to realize you are preaching to men and to women. And I think there's a tendency sometimes for blokes not to really think that. And if it's a sort of blokish kind of culture and men are thinking that way, I think that can be a problem. And that then, if there are some men who just don't seem to connect very well with women in their preaching, and then what you get is women saying, "Well, this is no good. We want a specifically women's ministry," and then I think then you can sometimes get an unhelpful driving apart, which then says to women, "All right, the Sunday preaching isn't really for us, so we want something else," and I think that's wrong. I don't doubt that lots of different groups, including women in the church, maybe do want and need other things too. But I would be very concerned if the women in our church felt that Sunday was for the men, the preaching was for the men, and then we had to have other things for the women. So I think that's quite unhelpful. But I know there are others who think differently from that. But it seems to me unnatural.
I think we've worked really very hard after a very long day and a couple of long days working with trainee ministers and others. He spent all night talking to us, so will you thank him with me?